The ability to think analytically is an important skill both in business and in life. Having this skill will pay dividends in many areas, including job performance. It may even help bring a little bit of clarity to some of life's more important decisions. Hi, I'm Sean John Thompson, and today I'm going to teach you how to think analytically. Before we dive any deeper, let me define what I mean by analytical thinking. Analytical thinking is the simplifying of complex ideas, tasks, or problems. In other words, it's taking something complex and distilling it down to its essence or its most simple form. Today I'm going to teach you a 3-step process that will help you improve your analytical thinking ability. I'm going to show you this 3-step process by way of solving a problem together. There's a famous Google interview question that I think showcases the analytical thinking process perfectly. The question is designed to challenge and make you think beyond the first answer that pops in your head. So the interview question is this: how many piano tuners are there in New York City? An interesting and somewhat strange question, and definitely one that makes you think. Keep in mind, as we try to answer this question, we're not looking for perfection, but rather to simplify a complex problem and come up with an approximate or estimated solution. So how does one go about determining how many piano tuners there are in New York City? Well, let's start with step 1 in the analytical thinking process. The first step in the analytical thinking process is to take a step back and assess the question from a wider vantage point. This allows us to see the question from multiple angles and try to think of the best way to approach it. So once we've taken a step back, what is the big picture? What are we trying to solve for here? Well, the big question in this case is how many piano tuners there are in New York City. That is our big picture. So New York City is where we should start. So starting with New York City, we should look at the population first, because it's likely that the piano tuner lives in the city itself. So let's start there. So I did a bit of research and I found that there are approximately 8.5 million people that live in New York City. And likely those piano tuners are part of that 8.5 million. So that 8.5 million population is our big picture, or the starting point. That brings us to step 2. Step 2 is to think in layers. So we know that the piano tuner is likely part of that big picture population of 8.5 million. So a piano tuner needs to have a piano to tune. And it's likely that not every single one of those 8.5 million people in our big picture own a piano. It's probably more like there's one per household. So what do we need to think about? So we need to estimate a couple things. One is the number of households within New York City. And 2 is the number of households that we determine how many of them own a piano. So those are our 2 initial layers below the big picture. So how do we go about solving for this? Well, that brings us to step 3, which is to process and then synthesize. So as we start to process, let's think logically for a minute. Think about your personal experience. How many of your friends or maybe your family own a piano? I'm going to venture a guess and say 1 out of every 5, or 20% of households, own a piano. We need to first determine how many households there are in New York City. So if we take our 8.5 million, which is our big picture, and we said that the average household in New York City is made up of 3 people, we can take our 8.5 million divided by 3 to get the number of households in New York City. So in this case, 8.5 million divided by 3 is 2.8 million households. So that's the number of households in New York City. And if you recall, we guessed that roughly 20%, or 1 in 5, own a piano. So if we do 2.8 times by that 20%, we roughly get that there are 566,000 pianos in New York City. Okay, so backing up again, we know that out of 8.5 million people, there are roughly 2.8 million households, and of that, we estimated that 20% own a piano. So that got us to the number of pianos in New York City, which is 566,000. That is the population available to our piano tuners to tune. Okay, so what's next? Well, it's highly unlikely that every single one of those 566,000 pianos needs to be tuned every single year. So it's some subset of that number that we need to think about in order to guess how many pianos actually need to be tuned every year. So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm just going to throw out a guess and say that, let's say 10% need to be tuned every year. So we're going to take our 566,000 multiplied by 10%, and that gets us to 56,000 pianos that need to be tuned every year. I don't know, that seems a bit high to me. I think we should reduce that 10% down to 5%. So if we do that, if we take our 566,000 times 5%, what we end up with is 28,000 pianos. What we've done is that we've said out of the population of total pianos of 566,000 that are available for the tuner to tune, roughly about 28,000 of them need to be tuned each and every year. So the piano tuners in New York have the ability to tune 28,000 pianos each year in the city. Okay, great. So let's think about Mr. Piano Tuner himself. How many pianos can one tuner tune each year? Well, I have no idea, but let's just guess that the average piano tuner works roughly 2,000 hours a year, or 250 work days, and then 8 hours a day. Perhaps it takes, let's say, 3 hours to tune a piano, just a guess. So that 3 hours, when you take in the travel time to and from different locations, the guy's got to eat lunch, a few other things, then you get roughly that the piano tuner can tune 2 pianos each workday. Not bad. All right, so how many pianos can the tuner tune a year? Well, if we take our 250 work days multiplied by 2 pianos a day, we get a total of 500 pianos per year. Okay, now we're getting really close. So how many piano tuners are there in New York City? Well, recall, we found that there were 28,000 pianos available to tune. The average piano tuner can tune 500 pianos a year. So if we take 28,000 divided by 500 pianos each, we get a number of 56. So through the analytical thinking process, we determined that there are an estimated 56 piano tuners currently residing in New York City that tune roughly 28,000 pianos a year. Seems reasonable to me. All right, so let's recap. What have we done here? Well, we started with the big picture to try and solve the problem. We then thought a little bit more granularly in layers and tried to figure out what we need to solve for. From there, we processed that information into actionable, usable data that we then synthesize into information that we then use to determine the number of piano tuners living in New York City. So how close were we? Well, I'll link to a Google search I did in the description below. But according to my research, there are roughly 62 piano tuners in New York City. So 56 versus 62, not bad. We did pretty good on our estimate. So that's the analytical thinking process. Analytical thinking takes practice and time. Eventually, you'll start to think this way naturally. And over time, you'll be able to simplify life's most complex problems.